The clatter of forks and knives was almost as loud as the laughter that followed. Friday nights at the West Side Grill in Midtown Manhattan were always chaos, orders flying, waiters darting between tables, the bar shaking with shouts for cocktails, but tonight the noise carried an extra bite. It happened in a single moment, sudden as a slap. Amma balanced a tray stacked with 3 plates, her shoulders squared, her chin slightly dipped in the way she had learned to keep the load steady. She approached a corner booth where 4 coworkers leaned too casually against the cushioned seat, their aprons folded instead of tied. They weren't supposed to be sitting there at all. It was a table meant for guests, but they had claimed it, as they often did, like a stage. "Say it again," one of them, Mark, smirked as Amma greeted the millionaire guest sitting nearby. His smirk curled into cruelty. "Come on, give us that fancy hello. Roll those R's for us." The others chuckled. Amma kept her eyes low, placing the tray down carefully. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to West Side Grill. Can I offer you?" "Offer you?" Jessica, the hostess with her perfect blonde bob, interrupted with exaggerated mimicry. She twisted her mouth into a parody of Amma's West African cadence. "Can I offer you? Oh my God, do it again." She laughed, snapping her fingers like she was calling a dog. The sound of her voice sliced through the air. Diners at nearby tables turned, some with polite confusion, others with amusement. Laughter spread like a contagion. The bartender chuckled. Even the manager, standing at the end of the bar, allowed himself a grin. The millionaire guest didn't laugh. He sat still, a hand resting on the tablecloth, his eyes steady on Amma. His tailored navy suit caught the light, his cufflinks flashing like signals no one else could read. Amma's hands trembled, but only slightly. She placed the plates before the laughing coworkers with the precision of ritual. She did not rush, she did not stammer. The humiliation burned across her skin, but her voice remained even, measured. She bent, picked up a fallen napkin from the floor, and laid it across the table with deliberate care, smoothing it as if smoothing her own rage. Then she straightened and turned to face the table of mockers. Her eyes, dark, calm, unblinking, met theirs one by one. The laughter weakened, snagged on something in her gaze. Jessica looked away first, fumbling with her phone. Mark cleared his throat. Amma turned to the millionaire guest, inclining her head in respect. "Thank you for your patience, sir," she said softly. Her accent was there, rich and textured, unapologetically her own. The guest nodded slowly. "Take your time." His voice was low, resonant, carrying the weight of a man who had watched more than one storm pass. The mockers shifted uneasily, suddenly aware that the room's focus had changed. Amma stepped back, her tray now empty. The sting of humiliation throbbed in her chest, but beneath it something older stirred, a discipline born of years of swallowing insult and turning it into fuel. She walked away with her back straight, her apron tied tight around her waist. At the edge of the dining room, where the light from the chandelier dimmed into shadow, she paused. The laughter had begun to rise again, timid but insistent, trying to reclaim its place. Amma turned her head slightly, not enough for the manager to notice, but enough for the table of coworkers to hear. Her words were soft, almost swallowed by the clatter of plates and the hum of voices, but clear enough to cut through. "You're laughing at a lesson." The millionaire guest's eyes followed her retreat, his fingers drumming once against the table before he raised a hand not for the check, but to call her back. And as Amma turned, her gaze steady, the night shifted. Amma froze when the millionaire raised his hand. The gesture was polite, almost understated, but it carried a weight that silenced the mocking laughter still buzzing faintly in the air. For a fraction of a second, the restaurant seemed to hold its breath, the clink of glasses muted, the shuffle of feet paused, the background hum slipping into stillness. Her name had not yet left his lips, but his eyes said it, "I see you." And that was enough to draw her backward through time, as though his recognition had unlatched a door she had kept locked tight. The smell of grilled steak and garlic butter in the restaurant dissolved, replaced by the chalk dust air of her village classroom. The walls had been nothing more than mud baked hard by the sun, the ceiling a sheet of corrugated tin that rattled whenever the wind struck. Amma was 6, her bare feet dusted with red earth, her hands gripping a stub of chalk so small it made her knuckles ache. Her mother stood at the front of the class, her voice firm, her eyes blazing with faith. "Words are seeds," she had told the children, her daughter most of all. "You plant them in your heart, and they will grow into a tree that nothing can cut down." Amma had listened, wide-eyed, tracing letters on the wall with fierce determination. That was where it began, the belief that her tongue, though unpolished and heavy with dialect, could one day carve paths in the world. But for every seed her mother planted, there were stones thrown to break the soil. She remembered the first time she recited a poem at the village market, her voice trembling but strong, carrying over the clamor of bargaining voices. She had been 10. People had clapped, her mother's eyes shining with pride. But then, at school, a teacher mocked her rhythm, called it the chant of goats, and the laughter of her classmates followed her for months. By 15, she had learned to memorize speeches from the old radio that crackled in their hut, the kind that faded in and out with static. She mimicked the broadcasters, practiced the roll of foreign words, until her tongue felt like leather. Still, whenever she tried to speak English at school, there was always someone to snicker, always a mouth twisting her vowels into caricatures. One day, after a particularly cruel mimicry from her classmates, Amma went silent. For 3 weeks, she refused to speak at all. Her mother tried to coax her, her younger brother begged her to tell stories again, but Amma clenched her lips as though every word might betray her. It was only when her grandmother pressed a hand to her cheek and whispered, "Your voice is not theirs to judge, child, it is God's gift to you," that Amma began to speak again. She carried those words across the ocean when she immigrated. America did not welcome her tongue. The city demanded speed, clipped consonants, efficiency. She worked nights as a cleaner, mornings at a deli, afternoons studying for classes in cramped community centers where teachers raised their brows at her pronunciation. "Interesting accent," they would say, as though it were a smudge she had forgotten to wipe away. She fought harder. On subway rides, she traced English words on the fogged glass of the windows, whispering their syllables under her breath. She stayed up late with her phone screen glowing, replaying YouTube lectures and repeating lines until her throat was raw. She studied pastors at church, absorbing their cadence, their control of breath. She practiced with waitressing menus, turning sirloin and Cabernet Sauvignon into mantras. But for every hour of practice came the sting of rejection. Customers asked her to get someone who speaks better. Coworkers imitated her when they thought she couldn't hear. Promotions slipped past her to others with smoother vowels. Her accent, she realized, was not an obstacle to overcome but a scar others refused to stop tracing. Tonight, though, something in her shifted. She had felt it the moment Jessica snapped her fingers at her, like she was an animal. The humiliation had been sharp, yes, but underneath it was something harder, forged in years of enduring and transforming ridicule into resolve. A steel core wrapped in velvet patience. The millionaire's raised hand reminded her of her mother's outstretched arm, steadying her when she stumbled as a child. It reminded her of her grandmother's palm pressing faith into her cheek. And it reminded her of every note she had kept, every line she had written in her phones, voice training, fold of the poems, the speeches, the fragments of rhythm she had sharpened in secret. Amma blinked, and the restaurant swam back into focus. The millionaire lowered his hand slightly, waiting for her to step closer. But instead of approaching, Amma made a decision. Quietly, without fanfare, she walked back to the counter, picked up her notepad, and glanced at the security camera mounted above the bar. It blinked its red light steadily. She had noticed it many times before, but never thought of it as anything but surveillance. Tonight, she saw it differently, a witness. Her humiliation would not end in silence. Not this time. Amma slipped the notepad into her apron pocket and returned to the dining floor, deliberately choosing to serve the millionaire's table herself. She had no intention of letting anyone else near it. If the night was going to change and she felt it already coiling like thunder in the air, it would begin here, at this table. She placed a glass of water before him with careful precision, her eyes meeting his again. There was no tremor now, only clarity. The millionaire smiled faintly, as though recognizing the beginning of something. Amma nodded once and thought, "I have a plan." The restaurant air buzzed with the restless rhythm of clinking glasses, scraping forks, and overlapping conversations. Yet Amma could feel the undercurrent of attention leaning toward her. The humiliation that had been laughter minutes ago had cooled into something else, a watchfulness that prickled at the edges of the dining floor. She placed the water on the white tablecloth with a steady hand. The millionaire's eyes lifted from his folded hands and found hers again. His voice was calm, but it carried the gravity of someone accustomed to being heard. "My name is Malcolm Avery," he said softly. His words were not meant for spectacle, yet nearby diners quieted at the sound. The name alone carried weight. Avery, the tech magnate whose mother's philanthropy had built literacy programs across the city. People whispered about him in business circles, admired his company's innovations, envied his influence, and now, here he was, looking at a waitress as if she were the only one in the room. Amma inclined her head, her voice low but firm. Amma. Malcolm repeated it, carefully, reverently, Amma. He let the syllables rest on his tongue as though they deserved to be savored. Beautiful name. Her co-workers, still clustered at the booth, exchanged uneasy glances. Jessica's phone wavered in her hand, suddenly awkward to clutch. Mark tugged at his apron, his earlier smirk flickering into something less certain. Malcolm gestured gently. The words you spoke just now, the way you said them, could you repeat them? Amma hesitated. Around her, diners had stilled, forks poised above plates. The bartender leaned forward. Even the manager, who had been pretending to busy himself at the register, looked up. She drew a breath. Her throat tightened, not from fear, but from the weight of memory, the years of practice, the rehearsed vowels, the countless moments when her words were mocked instead of received. But she steadied herself. And then she spoke. You can laugh at my accent, she said, her voice carrying like a current through the hushed dining room, or you can learn from my journey. The cadence was unforced, almost lyrical, her vowels warm and round. A hush fell, one deeper than the awkward silence of before. This silence was attentive, charged. The diners leaned closer. A woman at a nearby table lowered her glass without drinking. The busser froze mid-step, holding a tray of dirty plates. Even Jessica blinked, her painted smile faltering. Malcolm's gaze sharpened. Powerful, he murmured. Amma had not raised her voice, but something in her tone filled the space more than volume could. She had shaped her humiliation into a lesson, and people were listening. Mark snorted, trying to regain control. Oh, come on, he muttered too loudly. It's just an accent. But the words landed weakly, falling flat in the new silence. No one laughed. No one followed his lead. He shifted in his seat, the bravado bleeding from his expression. Amma stood still, her posture graceful, her apron a shield she no longer resented. Her eyes swept the room not challengingly, but invitingly, as if she were offering each person a chance to witness something larger than themselves. Malcolm leaned forward, his elbows resting lightly on the table. Amma, he said clearly, would you be willing to speak tonight? To share more than what they tried to mock? Her chest tightened. Part of her wanted to retreat, to stay within the small world of service where safety meant silence. But another part, the one forged in her mother's classroom, in her grandmother's whispered blessing, in every subway ride where she mouthed words into glass rose to answer. I will, she said simply. The whisper of agreement rippled through the room. Someone clapped once, tentatively. Another nodded. Malcolm reached into his jacket and pulled out a card, placing it on the table without fanfare. If you choose to speak beyond this room, he said quietly, I'll make sure you're heard. Amma looked at the card. The embossed letters gleamed in the low light. Malcolm Avery Foundation. Her hand hovered but did not yet take it. She wasn't ready to grasp what it meant. Not yet. Instead, she drew out her phone. The screen lit up with a familiar folder, voice training. She scrolled past dozens of recordings, her late-night practice sessions, her attempts at cadence, fragments of poems she had scribbled between shifts. One file stood out, labeled simply, Directions to My Voice. Her finger lingered over the play button. The room waited, a collective inhale. And in that suspended moment, the security camera above the bar blinked steadily, as if recording not just images but the turning of tides. Amma looked up, her lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile. The room was still holding its breath. Amma's finger hovered above the glowing file on her phone, the one she had recorded during sleepless nights, her whispering voice echoing in the tiny apartment she shared with her cousin. She didn't press play. Not yet. Instead, she slipped the phone into her apron, as though tucking a secret weapon back into its holster. I need 1 minute, she said quietly, but her words carried, reaching every corner of the restaurant. The diners turned toward her, uncertain but curious. The laughter that had begun the night was nowhere now. In its place was a collective attention, fragile but magnetic. Malcolm Avery leaned back in his chair and nodded once, like a judge granting permission in a court. Take it. Amma drew in a breath and unclipped the pen from her notepad. Her fingers were steady. Westside Grill, she began, has an employee handbook. We all signed it when we were hired. It says this workplace promises dignity across race, across gender, across language. Her accent curved over the words, unapologetic. But promises are only real when we hold them accountable. She tapped her phone, swiped, and pressed play. The restaurant filled with the tinny crackle of a recording. God, listen to him, he sounds like a voodoo priest. The voice on the recording was unmistakable. Jessica. Her laugh followed, sharp and cruel. Another voice chimed in Mark's mocking syllables of Haitian Creole. Gasps spread through the diners. Heads turned. Even those who had once chuckled now froze, shame prickling their faces. Amma paused the recording. That was last week. Directed at a Haitian busser, I reported it. She pulled a folded printout from her apron pocket and held it up. This is the time-stamped text I sent our manager. The crowd leaned closer. Her voice stayed calm, though every word struck like iron on an anvil. His response was, and I quote, "Handle it yourself." All eyes swiveled toward the manager, his face flushed red, his grin faltering. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Only a strangled laugh. "Now, come on," he stammered. "This is being taken out of." But before he could finish, 2 employees stepped forward. The busser, a quiet man with a shy smile, nodded. "She's telling the truth." A line cook raised his chin. "Yeah, I've heard it too. More than once." The restaurant shifted, the very air bending. A murmur began at the back tables. A young woman whispered to her date, "I saw that in a Yelp review someone mentioned staff mocking accents here." The bartender, phone in hand, pulled up the review and read it aloud. "Loved the food, but uncomfortable hearing staff tease someone's voice behind the counter. Won't return." Silence fell again, this time heavy as a verdict. Jessica's face drained of color. Mark rubbed his hands together nervously. The manager's laugh died entirely. Malcolm Avery folded his hands, his gaze sharp. "Receipts," he said quietly, almost approvingly. "Respect has receipts." Amma closed her phone and slipped it back into her apron. Her chest rose and fell, not with fear, but with the rhythm of someone who had rehearsed this moment in her heart 1,000 times. "This is not about punishment," she said, her eyes sweeping the room. "It is about culture. You can't serve dignity to your customers if you starve your workers of it first." A ripple of murmurs ran across the dining room. The diners who had laughed earlier shifted in discomfort, others nodded, admiration flickering in their eyes. The manager stepped forward, trying to seize control. "Amma, enough. This is a restaurant, not a—" But she cut him off, her voice firm. "Yes, it is a restaurant. And restaurants are where voices gather. Every accent you hear, whether from the waiter, the cook, or the guest carries a story. Tonight you mocked mine. But stories don't disappear because you laugh at them, they grow stronger." The weight of her words fell across the floor like stones. And then she did something no one expected. She pointed to the microphone stand by the piano, sitting idle in the corner. It was dusty, unused, a relic of nights when live jazz had filled the room before management cut the budget. "Mockery is cheap," she said softly. "But a voice, when given space, is priceless." Her eyes locked on Jessica and Mark, then flicked to the manager. "You want to laugh at my accent? Then hear what it can really do." The room stirred, electricity building. Diners craned their necks, eyes darting between the silent microphone and the waitress who suddenly looked less like staff and more like someone who had been waiting her entire life for a stage. Malcolm Avery's lips curved into the faintest smile. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly. Amma began to walk toward the microphone. Each step sounded louder than the clatter of plates or the hum of the kitchen. The spotlight over the piano caught her figure, throwing her shadow long across the wall. She placed her hand on the stand, fingers curling around the cool metal. For a moment, she closed her eyes, gathering breath. "This was the first reveal," she said. "But it is not the last." Her voice deepened, resonant. "If you think a recording is powerful, wait until you hear the truth that lives in every breath I've trained, every word I've sharpened, every note I've carried from my mother's classroom to this very room." She lifted her chin. "I promise you, the next sound you hear will not just be my accent, it will be my story. And stories, when they are spoken, can change everything." The room was trembling now, restless, hungry for what was coming. Even the skeptics couldn't look away. Amma's eyes scanned the room, settling briefly on the busser who had been mocked, then on Malcolm Avery, who gave her the smallest of nods, a silent contract. Her grip tightened on the mic. The microphone gave a low hum as Amma adjusted it, her fingers brushing the cold steel. For a heartbeat, the restaurant existed in 2 worlds at once: the ordinary bustle of clattering dishes in the kitchen, and the extraordinary hush in the dining room where every pair of eyes locked onto the black waitress who dared to take the stage. Jessica shifted uncomfortably at her booth, her painted nails tapping against her phone screen. Mark forced a laugh, loud and brittle. "What is this, open mic night?" he sneered. But no one joined him. The silence that met his attempt at humor was suffocating. Amma inhaled deeply. She did not need a piano, but she asked for it anyway. Her voice was calm, certain. "Just one note, please." The bartender, caught between duty and awe, struck the rim of a glass with a spoon. The sound rang out, pure and steady, a single pitch shimmering in the air. Amma closed her eyes and let the note settle in her chest. She remembered every late night in her apartment, standing before the cracked mirror, practicing breath control, pacing, projection. She remembered whispering lines into her phone until her throat ached. She remembered her mother's words, "Your voice is not their cage, it is your wings." And then she began. It wasn't a song, it wasn't quite a speech either. It was something in between spoken word, poetry, storytelling all woven into one. She called it, "Directions to My Voice." Her words painted the journey. She spoke of her village, where chalk dust had floated like fireflies in the evening light. She spoke of the radio static that carried strange accents across oceans, teaching her rhythm before she knew grammar. She spoke of laughter, yes, the cruel kind, the kind that stung when teachers or co-workers twisted her vowels into caricatures. But she also spoke of endurance, of how she turned every mockery into a note of music, every rejection into a verse. "My accent," she said, her voice rising, "is not an error, it is an archive. It carries my mother's teaching, my grandmother's blessing, my homeland's rhythm, my own sweat and fire." The room leaned in. Forks remained suspended over plates. A woman near the bar covered her mouth, tears welling. Even the busser, the Haitian man who had once been mocked, stood taller, pride flickering across his face as though Amma's words were speaking for him too. Mark shifted again, tugging at his apron. She's just showing off," he muttered, but his voice sounded small. Jessica looked at him, her eyes wide, her earlier cruelty melting into fear. Amma's performance built like a tide. The cadence of her words rolled, gathering force. She moved her hands as she spoke, carving shapes in the air. Her vowels, once mocked, now thundered with resonance. Every line pressed deeper into the listening crowd, weaving shame into revelation. And then, without warning, applause erupted. It started at Malcolm Avery's table, his assistant clapping firmly but quickly spread like fire. Diners rose to their feet, some cheered, others wiped their eyes. The applause was not polite. It was thunderous, cathartic, the kind of sound that breaks ceilings. The manager, red-faced, tried to plaster on a smile, clapping along weakly. "Yes, yes, wonderful talent," he said, his voice strained. "What a surprise for our guests tonight." But Malcolm stood, silencing him with a single look. The applause dimmed, though the air was still electric. Malcolm raised his voice, just enough to carry across the room. "You laugh at an accent," he said, gesturing toward Amma, "and you miss a legacy. This woman's voice is worth more than this restaurant's entire reputation." He turned to Amma, his face solemn but glowing with pride. "Amma, as of tonight, I am endowing a scholarship fund for service workers who want to pursue public speaking, performance, or education. It will be named after your mother." Gasps swept the room. A woman near the door clutched her husband's arm. The busser covered his mouth. Jessica's face paled, her phone slipping from her hand. Amma blinked, tears welling but not falling. She placed the microphone back on its stand, her voice steady. "This is not revenge," she said, her words ringing clear. "This is just the beginning." The line hung in the air like scripture. Mark slumped in his seat, defeated. Jessica looked down at her hands, unable to meet anyone's gaze. The manager retreated toward the kitchen, his power evaporating like steam. The applause roared again, but this time it wasn't just admiration, it was solidarity. People weren't cheering for entertainment. They were cheering for transformation, for a woman who had taken humiliation and turned it into a testament. Amma stepped down from the platform, her body trembling not with fear, but with release. She had carried the weight of silence for so long, and now it had broken into something new. Malcolm approached her, extending his hand. She took it, her palms still warm from holding the mic. His eyes met hers. "You've started something tonight," he said quietly. Amma nodded. She didn't need to reply. The truth of it was already in the air. The echoes of applause lingered in Amma's mind long after the restaurant returned to its uneasy rhythm. Guests eventually finished their meals, checks were paid, and the staff retreated to the kitchen in fragmented silence. Jessica and Mark disappeared early, avoiding eye contact. The manager stayed behind, pacing in his office, muttering about damage control. But Amma was not thinking of him. That night, after her shift, she walked through the chilly Manhattan streets with Malcolm's card clutched in her hand. The city was alive with its usual noise: horns, sirens, music bleeding from bars, but Amma heard only the thrum of her own resolve. She replayed her words at the microphone, her mother's lessons, her grandmother's blessing, and she knew this was no longer just about her humiliation. It was about the thousands of voices, accents, and stories mocked into silence every single day. Within a week, things began to move. Malcolm Avery invited her to his foundation's office. The lobby gleamed with glass walls and marble floors, a stark contrast to the greasy tiles of West Side Grill. Yet Amma walked in with her back straight, her accent unsoftened. In the conference room, Malcolm outlined his vision, a grant program to fund Archive of Accents. Amma's idea for workshops where service workers could transform their voices into tools of empowerment. At first, Amma hesitated. She was a waitress, not a policymaker, not a leader. But Malcolm looked at her steadily. "You've already led," he said. "The night you stood at that microphone, you started a movement. All we're doing is giving it structure." So she agreed. The first workshop was held in the basement of a public library. 10 people showed up: busboys, cleaners, delivery drivers, a housekeeper, a cashier. Amma stood before them nervously, her notepad shaking in her hands. She began by telling her own story, the humiliation she endured, the choice to speak instead of shrink. Then she asked each person to share a single line in their own accent that mattered to them. A Jamaican dishwasher recited a proverb from his grandmother. A Polish cashier shared a prayer she whispered during long shifts. The Haitian busser who had once been mocked at West Side Grill spoke of how his father told him that his Creole was a bridge, not a burden. The room buzzed with electricity. People left standing taller than when they arrived. Word spread. Local libraries signed on to host more sessions. A community law clinic offered to help draft model workplace policies protecting employees against language-based discrimination. A restaurateurs association, seeing the positive publicity, adopted the policy and encouraged members to follow suit. Amma insisted this was not about revenge. When asked by a reporter if she wanted the West Side Grill shut down, she shook her head. "Revenge destroys," she said. "Justice builds. I am here to build." Her clarity made headlines. Meanwhile, consequences still came. The manager at West Side Grill, unable to shake the bad press and with staff now openly testifying against him, was quietly moved out of his position. Not fired, just reassigned to a regional role with no public-facing authority. Jessica and Mark underwent mandatory sensitivity training. They were shadows of their former smug selves, their power gone. Amma didn't gloat, she simply moved forward. The workshops grew. Donations poured in after Malcolm streamed Amma's spoken word piece online, which quickly went viral. Within 6 months, Archive of Accents expanded to 5 cities. Amma was traveling on weekends, standing in rooms filled with janitors, nannies, taxi drivers, and students, all of them rediscovering pride in their voices. Her favorite moment came when the shy dishwasher she had mentored at the library, Louis, stood before a packed room and delivered a 2-minute story about his mother. His voice cracked at first, but then it steadied, rising strong. By the time he finished, people were on their feet, clapping. Amma cried quietly in the back, recognizing in him the reflection of her own journey. Change reached the industry too. Restaurants that adopted the dignity policy began posting signs that read, "We respect every voice here." Staff retention rose. Customers praised the warm, diverse atmosphere. Soon, major chains began calling Amma's foundation for training. Her movement was no longer just an idea, it was a force. But with growth came challenge. Letters poured in, some grateful, some hostile. One in particular arrived on thick stationery with embossed gold lettering. Amma opened it carefully and read aloud. "Dear Miss Amma, we are honored to invite you as keynote speaker at the National Hospitality Summit, to be held at the Grand Metropolitan Hotel." She froze. The Grand Metropolitan. The place where her former manager had recently resurfaced, now working as an event coordinator. Fate, it seemed, had looped her story into a full circle. Amma folded the letter slowly. The thought of standing in front of hundreds of industry leaders, with her old tormentor present in the same ballroom, made her stomach twist. But then she remembered the night she stood before the microphone at West Side Grill, the laughter transforming into silence, silence into listening. This was no longer about fear. This was about legacy. She placed the letter on her desk beside a framed photo of her mother. She whispered, "We've come too far to stop now." Amma leaned back in her chair, eyes on the city skyline beyond her window. Lights flickered in the distance, like stars scattered across steel. She thought of the Haitian busser, of Luis, of every worker who had stood trembling in her workshops and left with a stronger voice. And she knew, the summit would not just be another speech, it would be the culmination of everything she had fought for, everything she had built from humiliation's ashes. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, each crystal shard catching the light like frozen applause. Rows of white-draped chairs stretched across the Grand Metropolitan's vast floor, filled with industry leaders, policymakers, and hospitality magnates. Cameras lined the back of the room, red dots blinking. The air hummed with anticipation. This was not just another keynote. People had come to hear the woman whose voice had reshaped a culture. Amma stood behind the curtain, her palms resting lightly on the podium notes she didn't need. She had rehearsed in her small apartment, in libraries, on subway platforms. She had trained her breath against the roar of traffic and whispered her cadence to the rhythm of her own heartbeat. Now, standing here, she realized something startling. She wasn't nervous. Her grandmother's words filled her chest like armor. "Your voice is God's gift to you." "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice boomed, "please welcome the founder of Archive of Accents, Miss Amma Kusi." The applause surged, rolling toward her like a wave. Amma stepped out, her heels striking the polished stage floor. The lights bathed her in gold, and for a moment, she thought of the dusty classroom in her village, the chalk smudges on her hands, the smirk of the teacher who mocked her accent. Now here she was, carrying that same accent across a ballroom filled with the powerful. She reached the podium, adjusted the microphone, and smiled. "My name is Amma," she began. The sound was calm, steady, filled with warmth. "And this accent has been mocked more times than I can count. But it is also the accent that raised me, carried me, and built everything I stand before you with today." The audience hushed. Phones lifted, recording. She told them about the night at West Side Grill, about the coworkers who laughed, the manager who dismissed, the humiliation that turned into a spark. She told them about the Haitian busser, the dishwasher Luis, the library workshops, the expansion into 5 cities. Her words were not bitter, they were instructive, like a map showing how to turn ridicule into reform. At the back of the room, half hidden near the exit, stood her former manager. His arms were crossed, his jaw stiff. He looked smaller than Amma remembered, as though stripped of the authority that once made his words sting. His eyes darted nervously whenever attendees whispered to one another, nodding at Amma's points. Amma didn't linger on him, she didn't need to. Instead, she focused on the sea of faces watching her with rapt attention. "I stand here not to shame anyone," she said. "I stand here to remind you, accents are not flaws to be erased. They are archives of heritage, maps of migration, songs of survival. They are bridges, not barriers." Her words swelled. She quoted the Haitian proverb the busser had shared, the Polish cashier's prayer, the Jamaican dishwasher's saying. She wove their voices into hers, creating a chorus that transcended borders. The applause came in waves, punctuating her speech. But she saved her strongest words for the end. "I was once told to handle it myself," she said, her eyes sweeping the crowd. "But no one should have to handle silence alone. Justice is not about one voice shouting, it is about many voices rising." Archive of Accents began as a spark, but you, every leader in this room, have the power to make it a fire that changes industries, laws, and lives. The audience rose in unison, a standing ovation that thundered through the hall. Cameras flashed. The applause did not stop, it grew louder, rolling like thunder against the marble walls. At the back, her former manager slipped out quietly, irrelevant in a world that had moved beyond him. No one noticed. No one cared. Later that evening, as the summit ended, Amma found herself surrounded by attendees eager to shake her hand, pledge donations, or invite her to speak again. But the moment that moved her most came quietly. Luis, the shy dishwasher she had mentored, approached with a badge around his neck. It read, "Youth Speaker Coordinator." "They hired me," he said, his voice trembling but proud. Because of you, because of what you built. Amma hugged him, her eyes filling with tears. Months passed. Then a year. Then two. The archive of accents grew into a national initiative, shaping workplace policies across dozens of industries. Scholarships multiplied. A short film featuring Amma's spoken word played in training sessions across restaurant chains and universities. Her story became a case study in business schools. And most importantly, in restaurants, hotels, and schools, workers who once shrank at laughter now spoke proudly, accents unhidden. Amma returned to her village once, walking barefoot through the classroom where her mother had once taught. She placed a plaque on the wall, "Your words are seeds, let them grow." She stood there for a long time, listening to the wind rustle through the tin roof, smiling through tears. Back in New York, on the anniversary of her speech at Westside Grill, she recorded a message for her foundation's channel. "To anyone who has been mocked for the way you sound," she said, looking directly into the camera, "remember, your voice is not a mistake. It is a map, a bridge, a legacy. Use it. Build with it. And never let anyone convince you to bury it." Her words reached millions. The comments poured in, people sharing their stories, their pride, their accents. Amma leaned back, exhaling deeply. For the first time, she felt not just victorious, but whole.